Going into Dark Souls 2, I was ready to go through an absolutely terrible experience. From my friends to people online, everyone was telling me that this was the worst Souls game in the franchise. After just finishing Dark Souls 1 not that long ago, which I enjoyed for the most part, I was wondering how the sequel could be so much worse. Unfortunately, everyone was right. This game is not good, but it's also not nearly as bad as people made it seem to be. Starting off with the story, I thought the story for Dark Souls 2 was a little easier to comprehend than Dark Souls 1. Of course, I'll be brief as I don't play Souls games for the story. Nonetheless, you play as the main character who's known as the bearer of the curse, who tries to break free from this curse that doesn't allow you to die. In order to do so, you have to obtain 4 great souls from old ones which all resided in different areas across the world. Along the way, you'll encounter various characters, all adding to the overall lore of Dark Souls 2 and making your journey that much more enjoyable. I think it's interesting to see what really happens once you get far enough into the game. It's like the game has you on one path and you think you know exactly what you need to do and why you need to do it, but then it throws a small curveball that changes things up a bit. I played the Scholar of the First Sin version, which gives you a choice that affects the end of the game, which I thought was a great addition. Once the main villain is revealed, it motivated me even more to take that thing down. An underrated aspect of this game that I appreciated was just the fact that it was a sequel. Yes, it doesn't occur directly after Dark Souls 1, but to know that these events happened in the future just makes everything feel connected, reminding you that these games are all a part of the same universe. Just like other Souls games, how much you understand of the story really depends on what you can comprehend and find throughout the game, and Dark Souls 2 is no different. I think as time goes on and I play more Souls-like games, I'm going to pick up more and more about the story and overall lore of the world within that game, just because I'm used to how these games work. Nonetheless, the story for Dark Souls 2 is better than it seems once you understand it fully. The gameplay for Dark Souls 2 is definitely where its reputation is built from. All this negative talk surrounding the game stems directly from the gameplay, and after playing this myself, I understand why. Instead of going through the pros first, I'm going to dive directly into the cons, which I think outweigh the positives this game has. First, adaptability. If you didn't know, adaptability is a new stat included in this game that can be leveled up just like endurance, strength, etc. What does it do? It affects how well you can roll during combat. Why the roll needed to be a stat is beyond me. I loved how it was in Dark Souls 1 where it depended on your equipment and how heavy of a load you were wearing. I thought it made complete sense for you to roll a lot slower when wearing a full armor set compared to wearing lighter garments. I didn't think there was a reason to include ADP as a stat at all. If anything, I think the devs could have made it so that it only boosted the stat. Like you always have a set speed or dodge ability, and if you level up ADP, then it only gets better. Having to allocate additional souls just to level up something you shouldn't have to takes away from boosting other important stats like vitality or dexterity. To make things worse, you still fat roll when wearing heavier armor so that functionality still exists. I think finding the balance of your equipment along with leveling up ADP to a good level is the only way to find common ground in this department. To sum it up, this stat wasn't needed, and I hope that it doesn't find its way into another Souls-like game ever again. The next thing that I absolutely could not stand about this game was the layout of some of the sections. It's not that the game's difficulty was hard, because overall this game was easier than Dark Souls 1, but the way the areas were created make it so much harder than it needed to be. From enemy placement to the location of the bonfires, it's just not good. If you're like myself, you may find yourself struggling on the simplest of things just because you have to account for enemies that really shouldn't be there. If I had to narrow it down to 3 areas that were the worst, it would be Iron Keep, Shrine of Amana, and Black Gulch. Iron Keep has got to be one of the most frustrating sections I've ever come across. At least in the Scholar Edition, there are so many enemies throughout this entire area. Right from the first bonfire, you have to lock in, as there's no room for error. From the sheer amount of melee knights to the archers, you have to plan exactly how you want to approach this section. There's absolutely no way you can run past everything in this area. Yes, you can bob and weave your way around maybe a couple of enemies in a certain spot, but for the most part, all the enemies would just close in on you in a hurry. How I got through this was slowly picking off every single enemy that was in my way, and if they were out of range, I would shoot them with arrows to kill them so they wouldn't be an issue when I got to that specific area. To make matters worse, the bonfires are very far from each other. Even running away from the enemies, it's a long trek from bonfire to bonfire, and if you make one mistake, you have to restart all the way from the first one. But wait, it gets better, as most of the time when you first make your way into the Iron Keep, there will be these OP invaders who you have to deal with before progressing. Oh yeah, and if you're a beast, you can fight the Smelter Demon, but since he's optional, I tried it out and left so fast. By the time you finish Iron Keep, every other level in this game won't compare, because this section alone is where the majority of this game's difficulty lies. Shrine of Amana was very similar to Iron Keep, but was a little more forgiving. For one, you have time to breathe before the enemies come after you, but just like Iron Keep, there's too many different types of enemies stacked in a small area. Between the swordsmen, archers, and giants, again, you have to pick your battles and decide who you want to take on first. However, what I did remember was what I went through in Iron Keep and crafted a strategy that consisted of shooting arrows from long distances that would take them out from far away. If you're skilled enough, you might be able to run past all these enemies, but in order to do so, you're going to have a nearly flawless run to the next bonfire. There won't be any room for errors or mistakes. In my opinion, it's just better to have a bunch of healing items and arrows and slowly take your time, taking everything out on your way to the next section. Honestly, I wonder what the devs were smoking when they made some of these sections. It's like they were going through some stuff personally and said, yeah, I'm going to take it on the players, because some of these sections are just insane. Black Gulch is the easiest out of these three, but I had to include it on the list just because of how annoying it is. I think the concept of a sort of poison cave is good, but was it really necessary to have so many poison spitting rocks piled up in one place? I get it, learn where the poison spits, and roll away accordingly. But even still, I'm just thinking about the game design. Like, how is this area fun for the player? You can see the fog in the distance getting you hyped for a boss fight, but having to go through another small section of hell just to get there is unnecessary. Playing these Souls games has taught me that get good reigns supreme, because you always have to learn or use what's at your disposal to win. But sometimes these games just have poorly designed areas. If you played this, let me know what sections you hated the most in this game. Another thing I wasn't the biggest fan of was just the overall speed of the game. Yes, the combat of Dark Souls is slower than other Souls-like games, but to me it felt as if this game's combat was really slow. Like so slow that I couldn't play the game at the pace that I wanted to. There were so many times that I was fighting a boss and would have to hold back on a clear opening because the boss's attack was so slow to wind up. You could try and attack regardless, but if you do that, you'll end up putting yourself in a bad situation because you expended too much stamina or got too close to the enemy. Personally, I didn't need this game to be lightning fast, but there was no sense of pace in this game at all. Add on the fact of the roll issue I mentioned earlier, and you can't dictate the pace you want to play the game at. You're at the mercy of the enemy you're fighting and must adapt to how slow or fast their attacks are. If the game was faster, then the combat would have been more exciting and the fights may not have been as drawn out. Of course, you could try and get ridiculously OP and beat the bosses in just a couple hits, but that's going to take some time, and even still, that won't speed up how fast the actual gameplay is. The gameplay in Dark Souls 2 is just too slow. No other way of putting it. Another critique I have of this game are the addition of multiple bosses or enemies during the boss fights. I understand there's fights like this across the Souls series, but for Dark Souls 2 specifically, it doesn't work. How the hell are you supposed to fight multiple enemies when you can't move at a fast pace? If you've got 2 or 3 enemies swinging at you at all times, that requires you to move quickly to evade the attacks, which you physically cannot do. It makes no sense. A perfect example is the boss fight with the Throne Defender and the Throne Watcher. Essentially, you have a close range big enemy and a long range faster moving enemy, and you're expected to kill both of them at the same time. And to make things worse, if you leave too much health on one of them, they will resurrect the other one, making the fight endless. If it wasn't for the help of a summon, I don't know if I would have been able to beat it. Normally, I would find a way to evade one of the enemies, but when your movement is so limited, you have no time to do that or heal. The only thing you can manage is to do one hit of a combo. To put it simply, Dark Souls 2 should have never had multiple enemies for boss fights because it forces the player into such an unfavorable position due to the way the game is constructed. Lastly, I wasn't a fan of the change to the hollowing system. In Dark Souls 1, when you were hollowed, you would lose the amount of flask you held when going from place to place. However, in this, you keep your flask but lose up to half your health instead. This gameplay decision I understand more than the others because maybe the devs thought that this change is about on par with how it normally is, but when playing it, that wasn't the case. This change just made everything more inconvenient. For me, I would rather lose the flasks, as there's many times that I don't need the full amount of them to beat a boss or make it to the next bonfire. But my health, I usually need a full bar of health in almost every situation, especially considering the amount of damage that these bosses do during the fights. In the end, you just have to adjust and get used to playing this game with half health, which sucks. Now, Dark Souls 2 does have some good things about it. It's not all bad. The most obvious is the hub area known as Majula. This is definitely the comfiest hub area that I've come across in Souls-like games, as the entire vibe is immaculate. It's calm and peaceful, offering more than just refuge, as there's other people residing in this town that offers goods and services that aid you in your quest. When playing a Souls game, it gets stressful at times, and having a place that you can go back to that has nothing going on is definitely a treat. Another thing that I liked was the fluidity of the menu. I thought the way everything was organized was better than Dark Souls 1, as it's easy to tell which items go where and which slot they get equipped to. It makes it really easy when configuring your loadout and saves you tons of time so you can go back to the fights. This goes for the stores too. These were never hard to navigate, just hard to find. Even though the sections themselves were annoying, the variety in locations was done really well, as there's so many different areas that separate themselves from the others. Some of them have repeat enemies, but even still, many of them are a sight to see. When you have time in between fights, exploring and checking out every nook and cranny of these places feels worth it. Finding helpful items while looking at the overall environment never gets old, no matter what stage of the game you're at. Yes, the boss fights were slow, but some of them were actually solid fights. They presented a real challenge and made you pay attention to their every move because of how slow the game was. I wasn't a fan of the additional bosses or NPCs that they would summon, but overall, most of them were enjoyable. I just think they could have been on a whole other level if the movement was faster. In addition, the design of some of these bosses could have been better in regards to their placement and their attack patterns. Like, look at the old Iron King. You can literally evade almost every attack it performs by just standing behind this rubble. Maybe the devs wanted the game to be this easy, but sometimes it was just a bit too obvious. Overall, Dark Souls 2 isn't as bad of a game as I thought it was going to be. Yes, it has issues, a lot of them, but it's still fun to play. If the areas weren't as toxic in regards to the layout and enemy placement, then getting to the bosses would feel as they normally do. Tedious, yet worthwhile. Instead, it just feels like a lot of unnecessary suffering for someone going through this game for the first time. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7. I debated on scoring this lower, but I think a lot of the issues with this game stems from the devs taking risky gameplay decisions that may or may not have paid off, depending on your opinion. Now that I've finished Dark Souls 2, I'm hoping that when I get to Dark Souls 3, it improves upon everything that Dark Souls 1 had in place, because this sequel missed the mark a bit. If you played Dark Souls 2, what did you think about it? Let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out one of my other reviews right here.